What happens when a CEO orders a meal at his own diner and discovers the truth behind the smiles? Jacob Reed, the CEO of a small diner chain with 13 locations, had built his business from scratch over the last decade. He prided himself on creating a family-friendly atmosphere, but lately, things felt off. Customer complaints about slow service and rude staff had been piling up, and employee turnover was at an all-time high. Jacob's regional managers assured him everything was fine, but the reports didn't match the whispers he'd been hearing. Frustrated and determined to see the truth for himself, Jacob decided to go undercover at one of his locations. He picked a diner in a suburban town, 2 hours away from his corporate office. It was far enough that no one would recognize him. Most of his employees had never met him in person. To make sure he blended in, Jacob grew out a scruffy beard, ditched his tailored suits for a worn-out hoodie and jeans, and put on a pair of thick rimmed glasses. He looked nothing like the polished executive who appeared on the company website. He walked into the diner at lunchtime, the place buzzing with chatter and clinking dishes. The dining area looked clean but dated, the booths slightly worn. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't the warm, welcoming space Jacob had envisioned when he started the company. A young waitress with tired eyes approached him, her name tag reading Megan. "Hi there, welcome," she said, her voice cheerful but strained. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Jacob noticed the faint bags under her eyes and the hesitation in her smile. Something about her seemed off, but he brushed it aside. "Just coffee, thanks," he said, sliding into a booth near the window. Megan nodded and hurried off, weaving between tables with practiced efficiency. Jacob watched as she juggled multiple orders, refilled drinks, and picked up plates from the kitchen. She was clearly overworked, but she never showed her frustration to the customers. When Megan returned with his coffee, Jacob ordered a burger and fries. As she scribbled on her notepad, a man's voice boomed from the kitchen. "Megan, what's taking so long? You're falling behind again." The voice belonged to a short, stocky man in his 40s wearing a stained apron. Jacob guessed he was the shift manager. He hadn't introduced himself to Jacob as he came in, something Jacob noted. Megan flinched at the tone but nodded quickly. "Coming right up," she called back, her voice cracking slightly. Jacob frowned. He'd built this business on the idea that employees should feel valued, not berated in front of customers. He sipped his coffee and decided to keep watching. As he waited for his food, he overheard snippets of conversation from other tables. A family at the booth behind him complained about waiting too long for their meal. A pair of teenagers whispered about how rude the manager had been to their waitress earlier. The atmosphere felt tense, far from the friendly diner experience Jacob had envisioned. When Megan brought out his burger, she apologized for the delay. "Sorry about the wait," she said softly, avoiding eye contact. "No worries," Jacob replied, offering a small smile. "You're doing great." Her eyes flicked up for a moment, surprised, before she nodded and hurried off again. Jacob had barely taken a bite when he heard muffled sobbing coming from the kitchen. He froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The sound grew louder, unmistakable now. It was Megan. He set his fork down and strained to listen. "I'm trying my best, okay?" Her voice cracked through the thin walls. "I haven't had a break in 6 hours, and I'm doing everything I can." The manager's voice cut in, dismissive and sharp. "If you can't handle the pressure, maybe you're in the wrong job. We don't have time for excuses." Jacob's stomach turned. He couldn't sit still. He slid out of the booth, leaving his half-eaten burger behind, and walked toward the kitchen door. What he saw made his chest tighten. Megan stood with trembling hands, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. The manager loomed over her, arms crossed, his face twisted in frustration. Two cooks avoided looking at the scene, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to step in. Jacob clenched his fists, his heart pounding. This wasn't the company he'd built. "Is there a problem here?" Jacob asked, his voice calm but firm. The manager turned, startled. No, just a little miscommunication." Megan shook her head, tears still pooling in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jacob looked at her, then back at the manager. He didn't reveal who he was yet. Instead, he said, "She looks like she needs a break. Why don't you let her sit down for a few minutes?" The manager scoffed. "We're short-staffed. There's no time for breaks during the rush." Jacob's jaw tightened. "There's always time to treat people with respect," he said evenly. The tension in the room was thick as Jacob held the manager's gaze. He knew he couldn't stay silent much longer. The manager's lips pressed into a thin line, but before he could respond, one of the cooks, a wiry young man with a nervous energy, spoke up. "Megan's been non-stop since she clocked in. She hasn't even had time to grab a drink of water." His voice was hesitant, but there was a quiet defiance in his tone. The manager shot him a glare. "Stay out of it, Connor, focus on your station." Jacob's eyes flicked to Connor, then back to the manager. "And who's in charge of making sure your team can focus?" "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like the pressure is coming from how this place is being run." The manager's face flushed, his bravado slipping for a moment. "Look, I'm just doing my job. If people can't handle it, that's not on me." Jacob's gaze hardened. "We'll see about that." Megan, still wiping her eyes, looked at Jacob with confusion and a hint of gratitude. "I'll be fine," she muttered, though her voice wavered. She turned toward the door, but Jacob gently stopped her. "Take 5, he said softly, "you've earned it." The manager started to protest, but Jacob held up a hand, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's taking a break, now." Megan hesitated, glancing nervously between Jacob and the manager, before nodding and slipping past the swinging kitchen doors. Jacob turned his attention back to the manager, his voice calm but steely. "What's your name?" "Rick," the man replied, his tone defensive. "And who are you to come in here and tell me how to run my shift?" Jacob ignored the question. "How long have you been the manager here, Rick?" Rick folded his arms. "About 2 years, and I've kept this place running just fine, so I don't need some random customer stepping in." "And you call this fine?" Jacob interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Your staff is overworked, your customers are complaining, and you're berating people in the middle of their shifts. That's not fine, it's a mess." Rick opened his mouth to argue, but Jacob cut him off again. "You might want to think about how you're treating people, because I guarantee if I were your boss, this wouldn't fly." Rick's face paled slightly, but he quickly tried to mask it with a scoff. "Right, well, you're not my boss, so." Before he could finish, the kitchen doors swung open, and Megan reappeared, her face slightly more composed. She kept her head down as she walked past Rick and back toward the dining area. Jacob decided it was time to step back and observe again. For now, he gave Rick one last pointed look before turning and following Megan into the dining room. Back at his booth, Jacob watched as Megan returned to her routine. She moved a little slower now, her exhaustion more apparent, but she still managed a small smile for every customer she served. Jacob leaned back in his booth, watching as Megan carried on with her shift. The weight of exhaustion still clung to her movements, but there was a renewed steadiness in the way she handled each task. The staff still operated under stress, but there was a shift, a subtle yet crucial one. Jacob had planted a seed of change, and he intended to see it grow. The next morning, Jacob arrived at the diner earlier than usual, dressed in the same scruffy disguise. This time, he positioned himself near the counter, giving him a better view of both the kitchen and the dining area. Megan wasn't in yet, but Connor was setting up the kitchen, moving with quiet efficiency. The usual tension in the air remained, but something was different. The team, despite their exhaustion, seemed to sense that a shift was coming. Jacob took note of every interaction. Rick may have been gone, but his influence still lingered. The employees were hesitant, waiting for the next explosion, the next harsh word. Jacob had to ensure they understood things were changing for the better. When Megan arrived, she was surprised to see Jacob already there. "Back again?" she asked, setting her bag down behind the counter. Jacob nodded. "Told you, I'm staying for a while." She hesitated before offering a small smile. "I guess I'll have to get used to that." Connor joined them shortly after, his expression cautious but curious. "So, what happens now?" Jacob took a breath before responding. "Now. We rebuild. We restore trust, fix what's broken, and create the kind of place this was always meant to be." The morning rush arrived, and Jacob took a more hands-on approach. He shadowed the employees, occasionally helping with small tasks but mostly observing. He noted where they struggled, where they thrived, and where immediate intervention was necessary. He saw how Connor stepped up to support his coworkers, offering assistance before anyone had to ask. Megan, despite her weariness, still managed to brighten customers' days with her genuine warmth. By noon, Jacob had a clear understanding of what needed to change. He called for a brief staff meeting during the lull between breakfast and lunch. First things first, he started, addressing the team. No more skipped breaks. Everyone gets a proper one, no matter how busy it is. If we're short-staffed, that's on management to fix, not on you to suffer through. A few employees exchanged wary glances. They'd heard promises before. Jacob continued. Second, staffing changes are coming. I've already approved new hires. Help is on the way. This time, there were murmurs of cautious relief. Third, Jacob met their gazes, making sure they understood he was serious. This place is changing. Respect isn't optional. No more managers barking orders, no more fear running this place. I want each of you to feel valued, because without you, this business wouldn't exist. Silence filled the room, heavy with unspoken emotions. Then, Megan spoke up. Does this mean we get a say? Jacob nodded without hesitation. Absolutely. Starting now, I want regular meetings where you tell me what's working and what's not. No more decisions made from a distance. For the first time since Jacob had stepped into this diner, the weight on the employees' shoulders seemed to lighten. The weeks that followed were filled with change. Denise, the new manager, arrived and quickly proved herself to be exactly what the diner needed. She listened, she led with fairness, and she worked alongside the staff instead of above them. Connor flourished in his new assistant manager role, guiding his coworkers with patience and understanding. Megan, with her well-earned raise, carried herself with a confidence she hadn't allowed herself before. Customers began to notice the transformation. Service improved, the atmosphere grew lighter, and positive reviews started to replace the complaints. Jacob continued his hands-on approach, ensuring that the changes stuck. He had learned a valuable lesson: a business wasn't built on numbers alone. It was built on the people who kept it running. One evening, as Jacob prepared to leave for the night, Megan approached him. I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything. It's different now. Better. Jacob smiled. It's only the beginning. As he stepped outside, he looked back at the diner, now filled with warmth and laughter. He had come undercover to uncover the truth, and in the process, he had found something even more valuable, a renewed purpose. And this time, he wouldn't lose sight of it again.